Hello and welcome everybody. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Neil Saab. I'm Senior Science Program Manager at IFANS, Institute for Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar on PFAS. And today joining me is Gwendolyn Jones, our Executive Director here at IFANS. PFAS and the regulatory environment surrounding PFAS is of tremendous importance to a broad range of stakeholders, in part is evidenced by the large number of attendees we have on this webinar today. We hope to impart on you some information on the impact on some current and upcoming regulatory changes around PFAS and how they might impact the food industry. Before we get to the meat of the webinar, I would like to pass it on to Gwendolyn Jones to say a few words about IFANS. Gwendolyn.
Great. Thanks so much, Neil, for that kind introduction. And let me also say welcome to all of our attendees. IFANS, or the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences, is grounded on 4 core values: scientific integrity, transparency, collaboration, and public benefit. As a nonprofit organization, we mobilize our membership from government, industry, and academia to drive, fund, and lead actionable science. As our name implies, our focus is on food safety and nutritional science, and everything we do has that emphasis on public benefit and advancing public health. We deliver our mission by catalyzing the creation of scientific knowledge. This involves funding external researchers and convening experts. We do this to support the needed positive change. I mentioned already that we bring together our membership from government, industry, and academia. And what I want to also note is that it is our collaborative and inclusive structure that empowers all sectors to bring forward the diverse perspectives across the entire food and beverage ecosystem. Now, as the next slide shows, we have a series of webinars, educational opportunities, and invitation-only gatherings throughout the year. And as we come up on December, I do want to highlight that we have from December 13th to 15th, the IFANS Science Innovation Showcase. This is a unique platform for a science-first, science-focused dialogue on all things new, intriguing, different, all about science advancements, ranging from alternative protein sources to food packaging even. So we want to invite everyone to also join us at the upcoming Innovation Showcase. And with that, Neil, because I know everybody is here to learn more about PFAS and what's going on, I'm going to turn the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gwendolyn. Just a few housekeeping comments before we jump in. If you look at your control panel, you can see on the top right, there is an orange arrow. You can use that to minimize or maximize your window. And also, because of the large number of attendees we have today, more than several hundreds, we ask that you type in your questions in the question box. We cannot accept direct live questions because of the number, but we commit to you that we will look through your questions, identify the ones that we feel the most pertinent, and we will ask them on your behalf. And again, I apologize in advance if we can't get to all of your questions. So with that, my pleasure to begin the webinar today. We have 2 presentations. The first one is by Matt Klassen from EPA on EPA's actions to address PFAS under the PFAS Strategic Roadmap. And the second one is by Hahn and Xin Tao from the law firm Hogan Lovells on U.S. briefing on federal and state PFAS legislation and regulatory updates, followed by a Q&A session. So we're going to kick it off with Matt Klassen. And Matt, if I may ask that you turn on your camera, please. Very good. Matt Klassen serves as the manager of EPA's Council on PFAS, a cross-agency group of policy and technical leaders who develop and implement the agency's PFAS strategy. Matt joined the PFAS Council in October 2021 after serving for 5 years as EPA's congressional lead for EPA's drinking water and PFAS activities, among several other assignments. Matt began his EPA career as a Presidential Management Fellow in 2007 and has served in EPA's Office of Environmental Information, Office of Water, Office of Administration, and the Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ, also among others. So with that, Matt, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Martin, and hello, everyone. Hang on one moment while I share my screen, and then please let me know if that's coming through successfully.
Very good. Yeah, we're seeing it.
Great. Well, thanks again, and delighted to be with you all today, this afternoon, or this morning, depending upon where you all are. I wanted to spend about the next 15 or 20 minutes or so walking through the different pieces of EPA's PFAS strategic roadmap. And so just as an overview for what I'm hoping to accomplish today is to give you all a background on EPA's PFAS roadmap. I wanted to spend a couple minutes up front with some background on PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, recognizing that many or most of you are familiar with these chemicals, but just wanted to give a quick overview that may be useful for informing the presentation to come, as well as the question and answer session beyond. I wanted to spend a little bit to talk about the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's approach and goals in releasing our PFAS strategic roadmap about a year ago, to spend the bulk of the time talking through specific actions included in our PFAS roadmap, with particular focus on those that are most likely to be relevant to this particular audience, and particularly the actions in our Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention. And then I wanted to close with a few cross-agency actions that we're taking, as well as some next steps underway here at the federal level, both at US EPA and in other federal agencies. So just as a high-level overview, the actions that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is taking on PFAS are organized under what's known as our PFAS strategic roadmap. EPA's administrator, Michael Regan, hails from North Carolina and joined the agency in early 2021, having experienced the PFAS contamination challenge firsthand in his prior role as the director of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. And he set up a group across the agency, which Martin mentioned in my biography, a group called the EPA Council on PFAS, which is a group of senior managers across our agency who are dedicated to collaborating across the agency and working together to tackle this environmental and public health challenge. And the culmination of that work was developing and releasing our PFAS strategic roadmap in October of 2021. That document lays out a whole of agency approach across all of the offices at the Environmental Protection Agency. It sets specific deadlines and actions for the period of 2021 through 2024. We think it fills a critical gap in federal leadership on PFAS issues, which has been developing for a number of years, while also supporting the ongoing effort of states in the environmental protection and public health space. And finally, the roadmap and the foundation of our work is on science and scientific integrity, and that's an additional pillar informing our work. So as I mentioned up front, I wanted to just spend a minute or so with a little bit of background on PFAS, or per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. PFAS captures a wide variety of chemicals that include both carbon and fluorine and the bonds between those two. They're chains of carbon atoms surrounded by fluorine, and they come in a wide variety of chemical structures. And there are between hundreds in commerce and thousands in total that exist of the PFAS compounds. On the left are chemical diagrams of two of the best known and most widely used PFAS, known as PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid, and PFAS, or perfluorooctane sulfonic acid. But there are many additional chemical structures in addition to these two. PFAS have been used in homes and businesses and industry since the 1940s in a variety of applications, including in food packaging and food-related uses that I'm sure you'll hear about more in the second presentation and in our Q&A session, but also used both to manufacture other chemicals in nonstick cookware, in upholstery, in waterproof clothing, and also significantly for firefighting foam to extinguish petroleum-based fires. Different PFAS have been detected in soil, air, and water samples around the world. And most, if not all, people have been exposed to PFAS. And blood testing done by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have found PFAS in nearly all human blood, or at least a few specific PFAS through their NHANES survey. And of greatest interest in environmental and public health concern is the known or suspected toxicity associated with many PFAS. There are a number of human health impacts that have been identified in both animal testing and epidemiological literature, from developmental, liver, immune, and thyroid effects. As I mentioned, some PFAS are relatively well understood, like the two on the slide, PFOA and PFOS, while many others are not. And an additional public health and environmental challenge is that these chemicals, also frequently known as forever chemicals, do resist decomposition in both the environment and in the human body, which poses an additional environmental and public health challenge. Next, I wanted to just cover very briefly the life cycle of these chemicals and how that translates into the approach the Environmental Protection Agency is taking. PFAS chemicals act in some ways like other environmental contaminants, but in other ways they act very differently, including their persistence, as I mentioned before, and the ubiquity of their uses throughout the life cycle of manufacturing, use, and disposal. And so the approach that the Environmental Protection Agency is taking is centered on a number of principles. First of all, considering this entire life cycle from where they're manufactured, how they're used, and how they're disposed of. We're really focusing on getting upstream of the problem, recognizing that PFAS are already in commerce, they have already created environmental contamination, but doing what we can to take action before they enter the environment and before they impact human health in negative ways. There's a strong focus in our roadmap on holding polluters accountable, on taking the actions to hold those responsible for particular types of contamination responsible for that contamination. Again, a strong focus on science-based decision-making in all the work that we do. And finally, a strong focus on prioritizing the protection of disadvantaged communities and working very hard to recognize the unique circumstances of PFAS contamination and the communities that are impacted to ensure that all communities have equitable access to solutions. And we have three goals in our PFAS strategic roadmap, which we refer to as the 3 Rs. The first R is on research. It's on doing the science, the research and development and innovation so that we can better understand these chemicals, both what they do to humans and to the environment and what those effects might be, and what we can do to help reduce those impacts or help improve our ability to destroy or dispose of them. Second R is on restricting PFAS, including much of the work I'll describe today on proactively preventing PFAS from entering air, land, and water at concentrations and in ways that could be harmful to human health and the environment. And our third R is on remediating PFAS, so recognizing that PFAS contamination has already impacted human health and the environment, and so taking steps and providing us with the tools that we need to more significantly remediate that contamination. And so next up, I wanted to spend the majority of my time today talking through some of the specific actions within these 3 Rs in our PFAS strategic roadmap. And before I begin, I wanted to again get back to the scientific focus of our PFAS roadmap and continue on the theme of bolstering that science and building that scientific foundation to better understand these chemicals and their effects and what interventions we can make to help protect human health and the environment. One of our strong areas of focus is on developing and validating methods to better detect and measure these chemicals. As you may know, these chemicals are frequently toxic or may pose human health or environmental effects at parts per billion or parts per trillion levels. And so developing the methods to be able to detect these chemicals is a significant challenge, both in areas such as drinking water, in wastewater, in soil, in land, and also, of course, affecting the food industry and other applications of these chemicals. So we're working very hard on methods to be able to detect these chemicals, both specific types of PFAS of concern, but also to work on additional methods for the total amount of PFAS or the total amount of fluorine in a particular sample. Secondly, we're advancing the science to assess the risks of these chemicals. So ensuring that we're reviewing the available literature, doing additional testing, and developing documents like toxicity assessments to better understand the potential human health and environmental risks of these chemicals. And then the third main focus of our scientists in our Office of Research and Development is on the technologies needed to reduce PFAS in the environment, particularly those technologies for destroying or disposing of these chemicals, to tackle the challenge of these forever chemicals and to provide technologies and recommendations for how to do that most effectively and in the most protective way. And next, I wanted to spend the majority of my time today on the actions of our Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, which I think will be the actions of greatest interest to this particular audience. Our Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention implements a few specific laws, including the Toxic Substances Control Act and the Toxics Release Inventory, which have critical functions in ensuring the safety of chemicals before they enter commerce, overseeing those chemicals that are in commerce, and through the Toxics Release Inventory, providing additional significant information about PFAS releases. One of the foundations of the work of our Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention under our PFAS roadmap is developing what we call the National PFAS Testing Strategy, which was released in October of 2021. The testing strategy is a major step toward the goal of breaking the thousands of PFAS chemicals into distinct categories so that we can better direct the research that we're doing, amplify the regulatory action that we're taking, and accelerate the technology and policy solutions for restricting and remediating these chemicals. And so this past June, we announced our first test order under this national PFAS testing strategy. Now, these orders require manufacturers or users of these chemicals to conduct testing in order to provide the agency with critical information on similar PFAS that fall within each category. And so the specific test order we issued in June applies to a specific chemical, but it will also inform our understanding of about 500 additional PFAS that have a similar chemical structure to those identified in our testing strategy. Secondly, we're working very hard to strengthen our oversight over both new PFAS that may come to EPA for review, as well as existing PFAS that have already entered commerce. We're working on ensuring a robust review process for new PFAS to ensure that these chemicals are safe before they enter commerce. And we're working to review existing PFAS to ensure that they're being used in ways that don't present concerns, and also to prevent the resumed use of PFAS or their use in new ways. Third, I mentioned earlier the Toxics Release Inventory and providing additional information about releases of these chemicals. We're working very hard to improve the data we have available on these chemicals in commerce. One way we're doing that is through the Toxics Release Inventory, and we're working on a regulation that would enhance the reporting under the Toxics Release Inventory to remove exemptions and exclusions that currently are limiting the data that we receive. We're also working on an additional regulation under the Toxic Substances Control Act that will collect 10 years of data on the sources and quantities of manufactured PFAS in the United States. Fourth, another focus of our work is on voluntary efforts to remove PFAS from the environment and from commerce. We know that voluntary efforts have been successful in the past with other PFAS, and we're investigating ways in which we can build on those efforts in order to take action even more quickly than regulatory tools could allow. And finally, and an exciting new focus of our work since release of our PFAS roadmap last October, is a specific effort to reduce the presence of PFAS in products that are purchased by the federal government. Last December, President Biden signed an executive order focused on restoring the federal government as a leader in federal sustainability. And a critical focus of that is on federal procurement and purchasing. And there's a specific priority for reducing the purchase of products without added PFAS. So EPA is working very hard to provide purchasers with tools to help avoid these chemicals, to identify particular products and purchase categories to pay attention to, and we're doing outreach to eco-label and standards organizations on addressing PFAS. And the Council on Environmental Quality just this past August released implementing instructions for this executive order to help keep this work moving. So we're very excited for how this particular work can make the federal government a leader in sustainable purchasing and help transition away from products that may contain PFAS. Next, I wanted to cover a few actions outside of the chemical space to give you a sense of the overall work under our PFAS roadmap. One of the particular areas of focus for our work is in EPA's Office of Water, which protects both drinking water and surface water. And the foundation, if there is one of our PFAS roadmap, is a commitment to set nationwide drinking water standards by the end of 2023 and to propose those standards by the end of this year. We're also working very hard on improving our drinking water data, doing additional monitoring of PFAS in drinking water, and EPA also released 4 drinking water health advisories this past June with updated scientific information on the human health effects of 4 PFAS. We're working on technology limits and regulations for particular categories of industries that discharge PFAS into surface waters under the Clean Water Act. We're undertaking additional work under the permitting programs of the Clean Water Act to develop additional analytical methods and to help work on evaluating information and providing data to states and tribes on PFAS in fish tissue so that they can better set PFAS fish advisories. And finally, we're working very hard on a risk assessment of PFAS in biosolids, which is a byproduct of waste treatment facilities and a potential pathway of concern for the agriculture community and for the public. We're also working very hard under the remediate prong of our roadmap to clean up existing contamination, including a proposed rule to designate 2 PFAS as hazardous substances under CERCLA, or the Superfund law, and the public comment period on that rule just closed last week. EPA is undertaking action under RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which is our nation's hazardous waste law. And we're also working to update guidance that EPA previously developed in December 2020 on the technologies and approaches for destroying and disposing of PFAS in the environment. And finally, we're also working to build the technical foundation for PFAS in air emissions, which is also a potential exposure pathway. I wanted to close with a few cross-program actions across the agency that we're working on and building on some of the themes that I've mentioned in the last few minutes. We have a strong focus on our PFAS roadmap in engaging with communities directly to better understand how PFAS contamination impacts their lives and livelihoods, and to ensure that we continue to be informed by their perspectives. We've done a lot of outreach and engagement since release of our PFAS roadmap last October, including in webinars and other venues like these. And we look forward to additional engagement with communities in each of our regional offices in early 2023. Using EPA's enforcement tools is also a critical focus of ours, gathering information from potential manufacturers and users of PFAS, and making sure that we're ready to act in case of situations like imminent and substantial endangerment of human health and the environment. We're also coordinating with our federal partners, including the Food and Drug Administration, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and other agencies like the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and coordinating with the Council on Environmental Quality and the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House to ensure that we're well coordinated, both on the work within EPA, within our PFAS strategic roadmap, and complementary federal efforts across other federal partners. And finally, and where I'll end for today, is we also committed in our PFAS roadmap to reporting to the public on what we've accomplished and what's to come at least once a year. And so we released our PFAS roadmap last October. I've walked through a number of the actions that we've committed to doing in the upcoming years. And very soon, we're excited to put out a public report that better outlines the work that the agency has been doing in the last year, and that also previews the additional steps that we plan to take on this class of chemicals in the years ahead. So that's a commitment we made in our PFAS roadmap, and a commitment that we're excited to move forward on very soon to better clarify the work that we're doing. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you for your time today. Looking forward to answering questions later on. And I see Neil back on the screen, so I'll turn it back over to him. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Matt. Interesting stuff, and we'll circle back with some questions. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Martin Hahn and Xin Tao. There you go. Make sure you're seeing my screen okay. Martin is partner at Hogan Lovells law firm. Using his background in food technology and his comprehensive understanding of the laws governing the food industry, Martin helps clients navigate through regulatory business issues impacting the industry from farm to table. Xin Tao is counsel at Hogan Lovells. As a former research biochemist, Xin works closely with clients in the food and agriculture industries to navigate the evolving regulatory environments and develop innovative strategies to commercialize products made with emerging technologies. So my pleasure to welcome you. And Martin and Xin, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Neil. And Matt, thank you for that great background. Xin and I are going to do a tag team. Xin's going to start off and then I'll wrap it up. So Xin, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Martin. Neil just showed a picture of me before having 3 kids. But this is Xin Tao. Next time you go to a Chinese restaurant, if you are a beer drinker, tell them, bring me Xin Tao. They will bring you a great beer. And I work with Martin. I'm a counsel in the DC office, Hogan Lovells. As Neil has summarized, I was a biochemistry researcher before I practiced law, and my focus is really on the pre-market and also chemical contaminants. And today we're going to talk about the FDA and the state PFAS legislation and regulatory updates. And before we go into the details, I first want to talk about apples versus oranges. As Matt has outlined very carefully here, I mean, not all PFAS molecules are the same. So PFAS molecules is a very broad term that covers potentially thousands of molecules. So every time you see a carbon molecule form a bond with a fluorine molecule, that's a potential PFAS molecule. And although all the PFAS molecules are man-made, as of today, we can only detect a couple dozen with test methods. Now, as food industry, we can certainly not comply with something unless there is a measurable limit, right? We can't comply with a limit if there's no method to detect something. So I'm really glad to hear Matt has mentioned, EPA is really leading the efforts in doing the method development. So just bear in mind, as of today, only a couple dozen PFAS molecules can be measured reliably. And my second point is, also as Matt mentioned, we only know a few PFAS molecules for their safety, right? There are certainly PFOA and PFOS. We know there are some animal data linking them to adverse health effects in human, right? But does that mean all the thousands of PFAS molecules are toxic, right? This is like saying apple is a fruit, apple is red, therefore all the fruits are red. This is simply wrong, right? The logic is wrong, because the fact that some PFAS molecules may be potentially toxic doesn't mean all the PFAS molecules are toxic. And so far, we only have data on very few PFAS molecules, including PFOA and PFOS, linking them to adverse health effects. And my third point is, there are 2 sources of PFAS in foods, right? Whenever you talk about PFAS, always make sure what PFAS you talk about. There's a PFAS that can end up in food from food packaging applications, like paper packaging. There are also very different exposure from environmental contaminants. Those are PFAS that come from the water, the air, the soils. These are 2 entirely different issues. So now let's look at food packaging. So food packaging, is heavily regulated by FDA. FDA has these pre-market programs regulating food packaging materials. There are 4 types of food contact applications in which FDA has in the past authorized PFAS to be using. The first one is non-stick cookware. Second one is gas case O-rings. These are the plastic polymers used on the pipelines. The third one is processing aids. These are the ones that you use sometimes polyethylene terephthalate PET as a polymer, or sometimes use it on the equipment to avoid buildup. And the fourth category is paper and paperboard food packaging. And for the first 3 categories, the cookware, gas case, processing aids, FDA has mentioned from FDA's perspective, there's only a negligible amount of PFAS capable of migrating to food from these 3 applications. Therefore, we are not seeing FDA showing any safety concerns with these 3 applications. But for the last category, the paper and paperboard food packaging, now this is word by word copying from FDA's statement. Under certain conditions, FDA thinks that the smaller PFAS side chains can detach from this application. Now, FDA is not saying that everything from paper and paperboard packaging will be migrated. They're only saying under certain conditions, which means under other conditions, there might be no migration at all. However, because there's a small chance under certain conditions, the PFAS can migrate into food, FDA has a potential safety concern with this application. And the important part for FDA's safety position on PFAS is, first of all, FDA takes the position that dosage makes the toxin, right? Everything is toxic if you consume too much. You drink too much water, you can die. And even for very toxic chemicals, chemical contaminants, if they're present at very, very low levels, there's no chance for them to migrate into food. FDA generally doesn't think those are unsafe, right? And also there are long-chain PFAS molecules like PFOA and PFOS. There are well-established animal studies. FDA has already deauthorized. There's also another category, the short-chain PFAS. These are, so long-chain is generally carbon chain with 8 carbons or more. Short-chain PFAS are usually 7 or less carbons. Now, short-chain PFAS were introduced to replace long-chain PFAS. And in 2020, FDA has raised some questions regarding their safety in the food contact applications. Now, FDA has already approved their use, but raised some questions because they think that some of the molecules might be biopersistent. And FDA took the position that we think longer-term studies are needed to understand their safety. Now, FDA has never said the short-chain PFAS molecule used in the food packaging applications are unsafe under the law, because if FDA believes these are unsafe, they will be considered adulterated under Section 402A, and FDA has to take enforcement actions. What FDA says is they don't say these are unsafe. However, they have questions. They think there are some uncertainty about the potential for these molecules for public health risks. And therefore, what FDA does is they're not taking them out of the marketplace right away. They're working with the industry to phase them out in a way that will not disrupt potential market for these products. So for the phase out timeline, essentially, people can still legally use this molecule, PFAS, short-chain PFAS molecule food packaging before July 2025. Again, FDA has never said on record they consider short-chain PFAS molecules as unsafe in the food contact applications. They just have some uncertainties, and they're working with the industry to voluntarily phase them out. Now we cover the food contact applications. Again, the food contact applications, the only thing FDA is concerned with is the paper and the paperboard. For the other uses like polymers, like processing aids, like non-stick cookwares, FDA is not taking any actions as of today. Now, let's talk about the second route of exposure, the environmental contaminants. This is very different from the food contact applications. FDA has been testing US food supply for PFAS at least since 2019. Now, their focus is not about food contact applications. They're not doing this for foods in paper and paperboard. They're doing this for foods produced near a site where PFAS might be used. For example, you have a dairy farm next to an air base where PFAS are used to fight fires, right? You may use biosolids from a wastewater contamination sites on your fresh produce. Those are the places FDA will focus on and survey the products because it concerns the water, the air, the soil may bring this in a dairy products or fresh produce. And also early this year in the summer, FDA has released results of testing seafoods. They test 81 seafood samples of clams, cod, crabs, and they find in 2 situations, they find the PFAS molecules trigger a safety concern, and they ask the companies to voluntarily recall the products. Now, in these 2 cases, the seafoods are canned clams from China. And it's very possible, one theory is that these seafoods are produced near a plant where PFAS molecules are manufactured, therefore they discharge the wastewater into the sea, and therefore the seafood has picked up the PFAS molecules. Again, all the testing FDA is doing is not about food packaging. It's about foods that be potentially contaminated by PFAS in the environment. On this slide, I want to talk about, give a cautionary note on testing food for PFAS molecules. Now, as I mentioned, there are only a couple dozen can be tested reliably. In fact, FDA can only reliably measure 20 PFAS molecules in food using LC-MS. Now, I know there are labs out there that can test maybe more than this number, but be very careful. If you're testing something beyond these 20 molecules, FDA can say they can reliable testing. Are those results reliable? And more importantly, once you have these results, what do these results mean, right? As Matt has mentioned, we only know safety, we can only do risk assessment on very few PFAS molecules. Actually, to FDA, there are only 6 PFAS molecules we can do risk assessment on, including PFOA and PFOS. So if you have test results beyond these 6 PFAS molecules, what do you do with them, right? I think you have to really think through about all these scenarios before you do any PFAS testing. And also, there's one testing called total organic fluorine testing. Now, total organic fluorine testing measures organic fluorines. As I mentioned, the PFAS molecules are carbon and fluorine bound. So if you test something as organic fluorine, it certainly covers PFAS. However, not all organic fluorine is PFAS. So this testing actually gives you a very exactive, very inaccurate measure of the total PFAS in something. And just bear in mind, this testing limit is usually very high in the ppm levels. And the test results of total organic fluorine in foods is usually offers very little value in doing risk assessment. It tells you nothing almost about whether these products can be considered safe. So be very careful of doing any testing in foods with total organic fluorine testing. Now, before I give my slides to Martin, I have just 4 take-home points for the FDA briefing. First of all, not all PFAS molecules are the same. There are apples and oranges, PFOA and PFOS. Yes, I understand there are safety concerns. Other PFAS molecules, not so quickly. And secondly, currently there's no total FDA ban of PFAS in food contact applications. FDA is only concerned with paper and the paperboard packaging, and they have never said it's unsafe. They have concerns and there's uncertainties, and that justifies the voluntary market phase out. And third point is, FDA is doing surveys of PFAS in foods, but it's not about paper and paperboard packaging. It's only about food produced near sites with PFAS molecules, and FDA can ask you to volunteer something if they think the levels trigger a safety concern, like PFOA or PFOS or the 6 molecules. And the last point is, before you do any PFAS testing in foods, pause and think about what tests you are going to do, what results are going to have, and how you're going to handle them. Are these results really meaningful for your purpose? With that, I'll hand it to Martin, and he will talk about mistake.
Thank you, Xin. You can tell that we're very passionate about PFAS. And so now we're going to pivot because it's great to have that background in terms of, yes, FDA has phased out PFOA and PFOS. We all recognize that those are very nasty PFAS compounds. You'll also see that for those shorter chain PFAS molecules that FDA has authorized for use in food packaging, there is that phase out, as Xin had said, through January or through July of 2025. But what we've had is the state regulators and the state state lawmakers throughout the country have been enacting bans for state laws that are banning PFAS in packaging and food packaging material. So here you have the list of the various states that have laws on the books today that are going to ban PFAS in food packaging. So recognize some of these dates you'll see December 31st, 2022 for New York and California, January 1st, 2023. At the turn of the end of this year, early next year, we're going to have the states of New York and California are banning intentionally added PFAS into food packaging. That ban is going to take effect before the voluntary phase out that FDA has in place that goes through 2025. We also see other states having bans for food packaging, PFAS added to food packaging, ranging in 2023, 2024. Some states, for example, Washington State, had recognized in their state law that those bans should not go into effect until they find a substitute for PFAS that is considered safer by the state. Maine had a similar, has a similar law where for PFAS in food packaging, it is not going to be banned until 2 years after the state identifies a safer substitute. The reality is we have a food supply and a distribution system in this country today that when you have one state banning a product, we don't have the ability as a food industry to say, okay, we'll keep the products outside of New York and California. So the reality is as soon as one of these state laws become effective, it is going to have a trickle-down effect. And many of our clients in the food industry today are really struggling with the fact that these state bans are coming into effect well in advance of that voluntary phase out from FDA. So going on to the next slide, Xin. Just looking closely at the New York law, again, this becomes effective December 31st, 2022. It bans anybody from using intentionally added food packaging materials that have contained intentionally added PFAS. And New York is focusing on paper and paperboard, as well as any other type of packaging material that is derived from plant fibers. Looking at California, a state that has a ban that goes into effect January 1st, 2023, also focusing on paper, paperboard, and products made with plant fibers that contain intentionally added PFAS ingredients. California and many of the states do talk about intentional addition. California has gone further and they've actually set a threshold, and they have said that any PFAS, total fluorine, in packaging above 100 parts per million is going to be considered an intentional addition of PFAS to those particular molecules. So Xin is absolutely right. Doing a total fluorine analysis is not going to tell you anything of value in terms of whether the PFAS in that particular product may present a health or safety issue, but certainly under California law, if you have more than 100 parts per million of total fluorine in that particular packaging, that would be considered an intentionally added PFAS that will be banned in the state of California as of January 1st, 2023. Now I want to switch quickly to Maine. And here's where we just got a little bit of a surprise coming out of the Maine Department of Health 10 days ago. Maine actually has two laws on PFAS. One is a general ban on PFAS that goes into effect after January 1st, 2030. All PFAS in all products will be banned in Maine as of 2030. The way that Maine law is written, though, as of January 1st, 2023, Maine wanted you to notify them that you were introducing into Maine a product that contained PFAS and provide the state of Maine with extensive information with regard to the PFAS in the product, specifically identifying what PFAS is in the product, what's its functional effect, what its use. That notification is necessary for any product that contains intentionally added PFAS that is sold into the state of Maine after January 1st, 2023. It doesn't ban those chemicals, but in order for you to have that additional 7 years to phase those PFAS out so they're gone by 2030, you had to submit that notification. Maine has a separate law, as you may recall earlier, talking about food packaging. And under that separate law that Maine has established, they've said you will have 2 years after we identify a safer alternative for PFAS to phase PFAS out of food packaging. Well, the industry had been taking the position that there's a law specific in Maine to food packaging, and so therefore that notification and that ban in 2030 did not apply. The Maine Department of Agriculture came out about 10 days ago and said, well, no, that's not how we're interpreting the law. If you, according to the Maine Department of Environment, if you have food packaging that contains intentionally added PFAS in that food packaging, you are required to submit this notification January 1st, 2023, so that you can then that you can take advantage of not being subject to the other law that's an outright ban. The industry has submitted comments to the Maine Department of Environment, asking that there be additional time, also questioning this change in interpretation because, quite frankly, the way the law was written, most food companies were taking the view that the Maine law for food packaging did not trigger the notification requirements. Those comments were due last week. Stay tuned to see where the state of Maine is going to be, but where they are today is if you have food packaging and it contains PFAS added to it, you are required to submit that notification to the state of Maine, or you can also submit a request for an extension of time because you need more time to collect the information to determine if your packaging is available. So it's really causing quite a scramble within the food industry right now because it's an interpretation that caught many people by surprise. Going on to the next slide. It's also important to recognize that while there are similarities between the state laws, there are also some very important differences. The laws, you have to look at the language of each law in terms of how they define food packaging, what specifically is being prohibited. Are they prohibiting the introduction of paper, paperboard, or food packaging into that state? That language really matters in terms of scope. We also see that many of the laws vary in terms of, how they are applicable. California, like many other states, is talking about intentionally added PFAS to paper and paperboard and materials derived from plants. California is the only state that has set that level of 100 ppm, basically saying if we test total fluorine and it's over 100 ppm, we're going to view that as containing intentionally added PFAS. Other states you have here are talking about intentionally added PFAS to paper, paperboard, and materials derived from plants, but they don't have that threshold. It remains to be seen, for example, will you be in compliance with the Colorado law if you have less than 100 ppm of total fluorine in your paper and paperboard in your paperboard packaging? Will that not be considered intentionally added in these other states that don't have the threshold? And then finally, while many of the state laws are looking at paper, paperboard, and materials derived from plants, other state laws are much more expansive, and they include intentionally added PFAS to any food packaging. So they're not only looking at paper and paperboard, but also any other type of food packaging, including plastic-based food packaging would be subject to PFAS as well. And if you go back to Xin's very earlier comments, FDA has approved PFAS as a processing aid that is used to make many types of plastic packaging. It turns out that the PFAS prevents the plastic from sticking to the mold. So when you're blowing out the film or blowing out the particular packaging that's going to be used for the food, there could be some PFAS on the mold to prevent the plastic that is being blown from sticking to the mold. Unclear whether that's going to be considered an intentional addition or whether that would just be considered a processing aid that's going to be exempt. And so these are a lot of issues that are very complicated for the food industry to deal with because each state law is different. And given the fact that the state laws are different, we don't have a consistent, uniform national policy with regard to how you're supposed to be handling PFAS that may be present in food packaging material. So go on to the next slide. We did see federal legislation that was introduced, but you'll notice that the dates of their hearings were back in 2021. We are entering a lame duck session of Congress, and the likelihood that this particular legislation is going to make the top of the agenda and actually pass is probably not very good, but certainly I'm not going to be here today predicting the probability of success of federal legislation. But in the absence of a federal standard with regard to PFAS in food packaging, the industry is being forced to look at each one of those state laws and trying to decide how the states are going to ultimately interpret those laws. And the only way you're going to be able to comply is to make certain that you would be in compliance with the most restrictive and conservative interpretation of any of the state laws that are out there. And given the number of state laws and the differences that the states are having, it really is turning into be quite a challenge for the food industry to have to confront. Moving on, Xin. So in addition to the state laws, which are going to start banning PFAS in food packaging starting the end of this year, the first of next, we also have to be worried about other state laws that are in effect. California, Proposition 65 is a law that requires there be a warning on any product that has a substance known by the state of California to cause cancer or reproductive toxicity. PFOA, PFOS, PFNA are PFAS molecules that have been added to California's Proposition 65. and if they're going to be present in products and result in an exposure, and an exposure under California Prop 65 can be through ingestion, it could be through inhalation, it could be through dermal. If you have levels of these PFOAs or these PFAS in your products that are resulting in an oral exposure, you could be subject to a warning requirement under California's Proposition 65 as well. And then finally, just because there's so many thumbs in this particular pie of insanity of PFAS, we also have to be concerned about class action lawsuits. We have seen NGOs issue a report with regard to levels of PFOA, PFOS, and total PFAS that they're finding in food packaging. That is then triggering lawsuits under state consumer protection laws, where the legal theory is you have PFAS in food packaging, and if it's going to be in food packaging, it has the potential to go into the food. That is unsafe, and that particular packaging is in violation of state consumer protection laws. And so the food industry is getting this on multiple different fronts. Not only do we have these state bans going into effect, but we're also seeing class action litigation being filed against companies that are marketing products that contain detectable levels of PFAS in their food packaging. Let's go on the next slide. And so where do we go from here? Well, obviously, we need to continue to monitor what's taking place at the federal and state level. As these state laws go into effect, pay close attention to what is coming out of California and New York. Those are the two states that have those bans that come into effect as of January 1st. Also monitoring very closely what's taking place in Maine. If you have PFAS in your food packaging intentionally added, you need to consider whether you need to submit a request to the Maine Department of Environment seeking additional time to determine whether your packaging is going to be subject to their notification requirements. We also continue to see class action lawsuits being filed against the industry, so it's going to be important that if you're in this space, that you're monitoring the status of those lawsuits. Do they gain traction? Are they settled? Or are they going to be successful in convincing a judge that they should be dismissed, because we have FDA, EPA very actively engaged in this particular area. It's also going to be very important that when you are in the food industry and a food manufacturer, work very closely with your packaging suppliers. Many of these state laws, although not all, are talking about intentional additions of PFAS. So working with your food packaging suppliers, asking whether they are intentionally adding PFAS to the packaging material. That's going to be very important information that you need to know in order to assess whether you could have an issue with one of these state laws. And then, of course, you may want to look at and explore internal PFAS testing. The reality is today, when we talk to the laboratories that have the ability to do total PFAS testing, and that would be just that total fluorine, they're talking about a 6 to an 8 week backlog in order to provide the analysis. And to Xin's point, if you're going to send your product off for PFAS testing, total fluorine is going to let you know what level of total fluorine is in the product, but it's not going to let you know what specific PFAS is in there. And if you're looking at potential health or safety issues to know whether it's PFOA, PFOS, or one of the other PFAS that we do know about the potential safety concerns that may be present with it, that requires a different level of testing and a different level of analysis that we have today. Going on the next slide. That basically wraps up the positive information that we have with regard to the federal, state, and class action liability that's going on here. We're fielding just a ton of questions from our clients because they do look at the looming December 31st, January 1st deadline. Those are very real, and those laws are going to become effective in California, New York, and possibly, and certainly Maine as well. And I see, Neil, you're back, and Matt will be coming back soon.
Thank you so much for a wonderful, scintillating presentation, all three of you.